1776. The British had just captured New York City, and Washington's army had just surrendered in Pennsylvania. There was a smallpox epidemic. There were casualties. There were desertions. Many of the soldiers had left because of harvest or because of business. Like these weren't soldiers like the British Army had. These were just men, normal men. Um, so the Continental Army had dwindled from 20,000 people down to just 5,000 men over the course of like 9 months. The majority of which whose enlistments were about to expire in within a month or two. So things were really not looking good for America in December of 1776. And on top of all that, the morale was incredibly low. And I mean, not to mention the Redcoats, they just moved into New Jersey and they'd captured territory, they'd captured a fort, and they captured supplies that George Washington had desperately needed. So his army, they really needed a shift in momentum. And thankfully, when you're at rock bottom, that's a solid foundation. And General Washington had a plan. He knew he needed to act decisively and that his next move would be the beginning or the end of everything. So his plan was to sneak attack the Hessian mercenaries as they slept on Christmas night and into the wee hours of the following morning. All right, so all of Washington's generals were on board with this plan, except for this one guy, and his name was General Gates. And he actually like faked a tummy ache and was like, "Yo, I can't work today." And then he ran off and he snitched to Congress about Washington's plans. And Congress was pretty pissed about this, but all these plans, they were already in motion. So, there's nothing that they could do about it. And another good thing that had happened is that the troop morale, which had been down so long, it was actually up because the entire Christmas Eve and Christmas Day they spent passing around a copy of Thomas Paine's newly published book, The American Crisis. And I mean, personally, these are the times that try men's souls. That is a God tier pep talk. So, as the troops marched to the river, darkness had fallen. The men were underdressed. Many of them didn't even have shoes. And a snowstorm had befallen them. But General Washington could be heard calling out, "No man should quit his ranks on pain of death." So the men knew that this was not the time to fuck around and find out. And George Washington, he was a beast of a man, all right. He towered over everyone, and at the time, everybody was so short. All the colonial people. That's why, the if you go into any old houses, like up in Plymouth or Salem or anywhere, the roofs, the ceilings are so much lower, and that's because everyone was so much shorter. But not George Washington. Oh no, he was so tall, and he had this charisma, he, and he had it while also being measured and calm. So he had like this stature. It wasn't like the kind of charisma that say like Donald Trump has, where it's really boisterous. Like he was just very measured, very calm, but people were drawn to him. He was well educated and he had a mind for strategy. And he knew the weight of this battle when many of his soldiers did not. He knew that if America lost, he would be lucky to receive a general's death, which would have been being shot. He was probably just going to be hung with the rest of them. But he never faltered. He never blinked. He went into this battle fearless, and his bravery made everyone around him brave. And that's just such a remarkable kind of leadership, and it's few and far between nowadays. So, of the 5,000 men left, 2,400 of them marched to Delaware, at the Delaware River. And once there, they loaded all the men, all the nervous horses, and all the artillery into Durham boats. And they would sail the 800 feet to the other side of the blizzard in the dark through ice-ridden waters. And this journey took hours, okay? I mean, it's 800 feet. It really should not have taken that long, but it took hours. Because they were getting hit with these white caps, no one could see anything. It was dark everywhere. There wasn't even a moon. There wasn't stars. There was ice, so they're trying to navigate around the ice. And I mean, no one could feel their faces. They all had numb hands. They didn't feel their feet. I think some lost toes. And the horses were all so pissed. They were neighing and shit. They didn't know. They didn't know what was going on. They just knew they were in a boat and it was cold and it was wintry and gross. And by this time, all the soldiers were worried that the sun was going to come up before they even made it across. Like they're actually thinking they're halfway across this river. They can't see anything and they have no idea if they're even going to get there before the sun comes up. But they made it. They made it to the other side and it's still dark and it's still gross and it's still wintry. And they unloaded their boats. And now at this point, George Washington, he was in the zone. He was just ready to go. So I set, jaw fixed, he began to march his troops to Trenton. Now, it's still a snowstorm. Okay, some argue a blizzard or a nor'easter, who knows? We just know that it was snowing and it was bad. And it's still dark as sin out there. And all the soldiers, they're battling frostbite. But to make matters worse, the snow and the sleet and the water from the Delaware, it had damaged many of their weapons and had rendered many of them useless. So some of the soldiers were asking George Washington to stop just so they can, check their weapons, maybe rest for a minute, maybe change their socks because it's pretty disgusting out. But Washington, he's got laser focus. He's like autistic at this point. He's like, no. All he would say was press on. That's it, press on. And they did. They pressed on and they made it to their destination. Now, Washington had his troops positioned on the high ground overseeing the Hessian camp. He knew that all the Hessians would be hung over from the Christmas celebration the night before and very slow to wake and organize. And he also knew that their leading colonel, Colonel Carl Van Dunrup, had taken a lover. And he and many, many, many of the Hessians were 18 miles away. So he wasn't there to lead them. Many of the soldiers were gone. And it was really weak and bad. So another interesting thing is that this woman, to this day, she's cloaked in mystery. She's only known as the widow of Mount Holly. And so if you ever wanted to look that up separately, I think, as much is written on her as we know about, but the widow of Mount Holly. But George Washington knew that Van Dunrop's distraction would be his undoing. So anyway, they're there. They're overseeing everything. It's still dark out, still gross out. And General Knox fires off a cannon to wake up the Hessian mercenaries and let them know that they had breakfast guests and were being very rude. So the American victory would be secured in under an hour. And when George Washington learned of the final Hessian surrender, he was so pumped. He was wicked pumped, right? He shook his officer's hand and he said, Major Wilkinson, this is a glorious day for our country. And then, and I shit you not, this is all recorded, he turns to his horse and he says, follow me. And he walks away with his horse and his horse listens to him because who the fuck doesn't listen to George Washington? Even his horse. All right, so George Washington promised to treat the Hessian hostages with kindness, and he did. And in his general marching orders the following day, he praised his troops, saying, the general, with the utmost sincerity and affection, thanks his officers and soldiers for their spirited and gallant behavior in Trenton yesterday. So the battle in Trenton resulted in roughly 910 casualties. Just 5 of them were American soldiers. The success at Trenton emboldened George Washington to cross the still frozen Delaware a week later and lure the remaining soldiers south to Princeton, where the colonial army would once again kick their asses. So George Washington, he molded multiple militias into this single standing army, and he conquered the largest and best armed military in the world. And that, my friends, is the story of the battle at Trenton. Now, if anybody has any conversations, I would like to open it up. So just raise your hand and we can have a little talk.